Why don't you guys come hang out with me as we build this Balsa PT17 Stearman. Welcome everybody back to Just Plain Crazy. I am Brendan and thanks for joining me for the build series on the PT17 Stearman. Again, this is the Balsa ARF plug and play version from Dancing Wings. This is sold by BitgoHobby. This thing, if you did not catch the unboxing of all these cool pieces, you can go back and check it out here and see what my thoughts and opinions were. But it's time to get into this build series. Let's get to it. When it comes down to building planes, everybody has their own way of doing things in the order in which they like to do it. When I'm doing a build series of a product, I like to follow the manual so you can follow along step by step if you need it for reference to help you during your build process. So looking over the instruction manual so far, it seems pretty easy and straightforward to follow. Does not seem difficult on a just kind of skim through before we get started. Some of the things that I've noticed, there's not a lot of verbiage in here to get wrapped up in. They use a lot of picture indicators. So they tell you if you're applying oil, pencils, fully tighten, use thin CA, medium CA, hobby knife, thread locker, whatever. So the first thing that we're going to get started on here is our landing gear. Let's get to it. So as we're getting ready to start this build, I've gathered up a bunch of the items that I'm going to need, and I'll cover those here with you quick. My favorite, high sol epoxy, so there's the 608, that is the quick drying, and then I also have the 9462. I love those dispensers because I know that it comes out in an equal amount. Low tack tape, we have some petroleum jelly that I use on my hinges, just a small ruler and marker. I have Gorilla Glue, and this is the stuff that I'm going to use for all of those Robart style hinges. Blue Loctite, thin CA, canopy glue, an assortment of toothpicks and popsicle sticks for stirring. This is going to be important to you. This is a thin CA straw that you can put on your bottle for very pinpoint application. We have ourselves a needle. I'll show you where I use that. A little container of water. And we have our drill with a small 1/8 inch drill bit on there. So away we go. So right away, we're going to get started getting on this super robust gear. I think this stuff is really, really cool. Hydraulic shocks. You're going to go ahead and take one of these leg covers. These things are identical. I see no difference side to side. And you're going to go ahead and slide this over that spat like so. And then you're going to place this one on there just like that. Now, this thing, when it slides up, kind of sticks or wedges itself on there, but if you give it a good enough tug, it's going to wind up pulling over or pulling off, and there's really nothing to stop this thing from sliding around on that shock. So they're going to have you drill some holes in this plastic and attach that up to the fuselage, but really from banging and moving around, I have a feeling this thing's going to pluck out of that housing and just float around here. So what I am going to do is, after I have this thing slid down, we're going to apply some medium thread lock. There is a right side and left side, so the little hinge point goes forward on the model. Once I have this thing installed, I am actually going to put some canopy glue around the inside and lower portions of this thing as I'm installing it. And then that will help to adhere this to that shock. And then when I pull this up before final attachment, I'm also going to run a bead of canopy glue around here on the inside. And that will help to adhere and seal this off to make sure that the two don't separate and this thing doesn't move. So let's go ahead and get to installing the front landing gear. All right, now it's time to start getting these wheel spats or these covers, if you will, installed. What I've done is I've used a ruler to lay them out so that way the pattern is symmetrical all the way around, and I've installed, I drilled a 1/8 pilot hole on the upper and lower to hold those in place. And now I have the marks to drill through. Once I drill all of those out, I will use my thin CA with this straw, and that's why that's important, so I can actually precisely, when I drop this down, wick it into the wood, and then I can install my screws in there so they won't pull out of the balsa sheeting where we're screwing this stuff into. If you get this stuff all over the covering, it's kind of hard at times to get it off. One of the ways that people do use, one of the tricks people do use to get it off is nail polish remover, but you never know how it's going to react with the covering, and not all the time does it come completely off. So we want to avoid getting any CA on the covering, but that's why we're going to use this really thin straw after we drill all of those out. So now that this is secure, let's get to drilling. We're going to do this on both sides. In this next step, we're going to go ahead and install the vertical stabilizer, the rudder, and the piece for the tail wheel steering, if you will. And I like to always dry fit things to make sure they're going to fit and fit well before I start gluing it together. And here's a good example of why. Again, those Robart style hinges, now they have this arm, the steering arm that they actually have, and it really only inserts in there in one direction. It's only going to fit in one direction. If you go to put it in backwards, it just doesn't work. They want you to CA that in. I'm going to use some epoxy because it's going to fill in those holes, and it's going to sit in there really nice and not go anywhere. So all of this will fit together. Get everything lined back up here. Everything will then fit together like this. And then you slide this piece in through the hole in the top of the fuselage up here. And when you slide this whole thing down, you're going to notice that that hole lines up, and then that's where our carbon rod goes through the support for the horizontals. Here's the issue. When that's slid into place and this lines up, look what it does to this gap right here. And where this tail wheel rod, this thing would get inserted up through the bottom. That goes right up through that channel. It comes out between the two. You could see there that I am a good bit off. So this vertical piece has to go back a 1/4 inch. Now this is not a bad kit or a misbuilt. This is balsa, guys. This is what we deal with when we put a kit together, and it's not the end of the world and not a big deal. So 2 approaches, all right? 2 approaches we have here. We can take this piece off, take the rudder off, and set that down here. Let me go ahead and pop that vertical back out. All right, so now that I have that thing loose, here's what we can do. You can see how that's pretty tight fit in there. I mean, it's pretty exact. The problem is that this whole piece has to go back. So I can either notch out this piece, all right, and slide the whole thing back, or I think what's going to be easier, so I'm not messing around with this covering, is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to take my Dremel tool and I'm going to elongate this about a 1/4 inch. And that will give me enough to slide that whole vertical stabilizer back. Now this hole in here will no longer then line up with that, and that's not a big deal. I'm going to take my Dremel tool and I will precisely clean up as much as I need to. Will it get close to this edge? Yes, not a big deal, because you still have all of these other pieces of plywood that are in there, plus everything's going to be good and high-soled in there. I am not worried in the least. So before we go ahead and we start dealing with hinges, let's go ahead and start modifying. And that's how quick and simple that was. Really quick work with the Dremel tool. And now you can see that we have a nice gap here. And as much as we can limit this gap there and still keep this clearance right there. So again, not a whole lot we can do here with this because of that one. And if you look in there, you can see exactly how far we're off. I mean, that's maybe 1/8 of an inch in that hole, and I'm just going to oval that out the same. Now that I have everything lined up so I know where to epoxy this thing into place, I went ahead and put just 2 pieces of tape and 2 pen marks there to line up, and then after it's glued in, I will go ahead and remove that. But first things first, we're just going to hollow that out, remove it. We're going to epoxy that slot in the inside of there. We're going to get this thing down in, and at the same time, I'm going to epoxy that arm into place as we had discussed. Let's do it. All right, the next step is we're going to go ahead and start to glue in our hinges. So the vertical is in place and this little arm is glued in and epoxied now. So let me show you how I do these. A lot of people like to use epoxy. I do not use epoxy on Robart style hinges for a couple reasons. Number one, over time it can get brittle. 2, epoxy doesn't expand. Epoxy tends to run and drip. What I use is Gorilla Glue. So the Gorilla Glue will actually start to foam a little bit around all the barbs and around those pockets. So when it starts to adhere to here, where it goes through the wood and stops, on the back side of that wood, it'll actually hang around and actually foam up, almost like a wall anchor or drywall anchor. And I have planes 30%ers, 35. And here you guys can see this is what that Gorilla Glue does. It starts to expand. So you don't need a ton of this stuff in there, just enough to cover up that hole. And as it expands, those things will be forever locked in there. 5%ers, whatever. I've been flying for 20 some years now, and none of these ever come loose using the Gorilla Glue. So this is the way we go ahead and do this. Let me make sure that you guys can pan down and see here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take some of this Gorilla Glue and we're going to snot that stuff right there on that little dish. Now you're going to go ahead and take these. A lot of people like to use oil. I don't like using oil because it can run down through here. I like to use petroleum jelly. So we just take a little bit of this jelly and we put it there into those little hinge pockets. And you don't need a ton here, just a little bit. And we're going to flip it the other way. And we're going to work it in that side. And now just work that thing back and forth a few times. Set it off to the side. And we will do that with each one of these. Again, we're going to work that back and forth. So our hinges are done. We can set our petroleum jelly out of the way. Now, water actually helps these things to react. So what I do is I get my little water container, and this is where I use a needle. You can drip some in on your finger, on a rag, whatever you want to do. Now, this water is not only going to help the Gorilla Glue to react, but it also will start to swell up that balsa wood a little bit. And I just use a drop or two, and that's why I use a needle. It makes it nice to control how much you put in there. And literally I'm just using a drop. So that'll start to swell that balsa wood a little bit. And now we can take a toothpick and we can go ahead and start to apply the glue down into our hinges. And I put a drop down into that hinge hole and just kind of really work that stuff around in there. Again, we're trying not to get it on the covering. If you have any that was excess here that we got over the edge, just use a little bit of rubbing alcohol on the rag to wipe that up, just the same way I'll wipe that off my book. And now the hinges, I put a little bit on the hinge as well. And you'll have plenty of time to work with these as you install them. Now we have just a little bit of excess here on this one, so we'll go ahead and just clean off that little bit. And the nice part about this stuff, if it does tend to foam or push out of the holes a little bit, you can then go ahead and just scrape. It'll come right off. So from here, what a lot of people like to do is if this hinge joint up here was tighter, we would want to make sure that that ball pivot is in the direct center of the pivot line. But this rudder uses a little bit more gap. That's not tapered. So we're just going to make sure that they're pushed into the center for now. But a lot of people will rotate these up and then they will take a straight edge. So if you can see like that, and make sure that these things are perfectly straight. You can usually eyeball them all if you put them up together and look at that spacing to make sure that one's not leaning or the other, because then they're going to bind. They're going to bind on you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to straighten these back out, and we're going to do the same process up here. So let's start getting glue in there. And now we're going to make sure that all of our gaps are correct. And here's the key thing. Make sure that everything turns equal side to side. You want to do this. You don't want any binding. And as I said, you got to watch this gap up here. We can't push this so tight that rubs, but we want to minimize that gap to be as small as possible. So if we got there just a little bit of a fingerprint, and go ahead and get some alcohol and clean that off. Now, so we don't bump this and move it. What I'm going to do is I think we'll keep, that may be a little bit too much to use as a spacer. So I don't really have anything, I guess, the right size to put in there for a spacer. But what I am going to do is we're just going to use a piece of tape to make sure that we hold this together. So that way it doesn't want to pull apart as that glue kind of expands in there a little bit. You could already see that glue is starting to fuzz up a little bit and react in there, and That's good. We'll also slide our tail wheel back into place just to have that help hold things together. So gap looks good there, gap looks good up there, and we'll let it sit. We're going to do the exact same stuff with the elevator now. The next step is to epoxy in our elevators. So try not to ever take these off and mismatch sides, because usually the holes are drilled together, so you have a right side and a left side. We're going to go ahead and the directions want us to epoxy this thing in place. So we're going to apply a little bit of glue onto their epoxy and make sure that we push that carbon piece into that hole. We do not want to glue these in yet until we put in that U-shaped rod, wherever that went here on my bench. I don't know, we'll find it. But that U-shaped rod has to go in here. So let's get just these put in. So we're going to slide this apart. Like so. And let's get some epoxy laid in and get both of these installed. Before we install the stabilizers, we're going to take this rod right here and we're just going to rough up those edges and put some grooves and slots in there. That's going to help when we epoxy it into the actual elevators, just to help give that epoxy just something else to grip onto. Sometimes with just smooth metal, these things can come apart. So just putting in some grooves, notches on every side. And now we're just going to install this first. I'm actually going to put it in backwards and then rotate it. And let's go ahead and test fit all of our elevators and stuff. What we're looking for is, once this rod is installed, do our elevators actually all line up? So let's check it. All right, so let's talk about a couple things here that we have to do. Now, they do note this in the instructions right there. This rod may need to be tweaked. And what's happening as this sits into mine, this rod wants to be facing that direction, but my hole is more this direction. So what I'm going to do, as this piece is placed over this way, I'm just going to take pliers and bend this one out a little bit. Now, the other thing is that you can glue the horizontals into place and still get this thing through there. And I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and glue in the horizontals with epoxy, let that stuff cure so I know that that is sturdy and isn't going to move, instead of trying to mess with all the pieces. And that is the way it's laid out in the instructions, so they're pretty good. Now, the other thing, when you guys put stuff together, hinge gaps like this are no good. You do not need to have these hinges in here in this big wide gap. You know, that's just going to give you a sloppy control surface. It's not going to respond very well and could cause flutter, which will rip the model apart. So what I'm going to do here is I actually want this hinge to sit, that circle part, that little metal pin right in there. I want half of that to be down into this wood and the other half to stick into there. So what we're going to do is use a drill bit, literally by hand, and you don't want to drill these out much bigger. And I'm just going to open up those pocket ends just a little bit, so that way the heads sit down in there. So a couple things we're going to do here, but let's get to it. All right, now I want you guys to see what I did here. It's kind of important. So number one, we have to get that little metal part of the hinge halfway down into this piece, half in the other piece, in order to get rid of that gap. So what I do is I use this end of the drill bit and I press and push, so that way they have a place for a pocket for that hinge to sit on both sides. Now, the other issue that's now created is that this connector rod here will cause a gap. So what I did is I recessed with a Dremel tool right there, and when I epoxy those in, all of that will be epoxied into place to be flush, like so. and we'll have almost no hinge gap, just enough to make sure that we have full deflection. So let's start getting our hinges and stuff put into place. I guess I'll test fit this one more time just to make sure we're good, and then we'll start gluing in with our Gorilla Glue. The next step is simply going to be to install the tail wheel cover. We've already adjusted that collar and tightened it down. So one of the other things that you can do, that's a little trick that I typically do on stuff, is I will loosen up those wheel collars and I will put just a drop of canopy glue underneath them and tighten them back down. And what that does is it keeps all that stuff from vibrating loose. Again, we're going to slide this over. We're simply going to mark a spot there and there. We're going to screw that down and then wick a little bit of thin CA into that wood. We're going to get back on track now into the manual, and we're going to, it's funny because they already show the flying wires done, but the flying wires for the tail actually come in another portion. But we're going to go ahead and install the linkage for, it looks like, the rudder and the elevator. And that would be this packet of stuff right here. And they tell you to look and mark. Now I want to show you guys, here's a little tip or trick. Get yourself a flashlight with covering. Now these holes are already there, or at least you can x-ray and you can see how that light shines through there. You guys see the hole right there in that hardwood block. So now I know exactly where the hole is. I'm going to open that hole up. We're going to do the same thing on the elevator because it works exactly the same. We're going to do that to install our flying wires and the linkage for the elevator and the rudder. Now there is, you got to make sure that the rudder is going to be a pull setup, so they're on both sides right there. The elevator only has the exit on the one side, so you don't want to be poking holes in that side for it. We're going to go into there to install the linkage. Like any other hole in balsa, even when we do the flying wires, make sure that those little tag holes are actually going to be in the center of the wood. This one is not. I'm going to slide it over slightly. That one's okay. And it looks like those up there in the rudder are going to be okay. But once you make a hole in the balsa, make sure you're using thin CA to wick in there to harden that thing, so that way it never works its way loose or pulls through. So let's get into making some holes. All right, so I screwed up and I should have checked. I knew better. I didn't. When you do a pull setup, whatever the distance is in your arm from point to point has to be the same from this point to the one on the other end. And if you want good tension in both your cables all the time to prevent snapping and slop, this has to be exactly on the hinge line. And if you guys look, I use their hole that I had shown you with the flashlight. And the problem's going to be if I use that, look how far I'm off from the hinge line. I'm probably 1/4 of an inch off, and I do not have a longer arm. That would be the fix for this. Now I do have other ones, but holy crap, that's for my giant scale stuff. I mean, that'll look retarded on there. So anyway, I hate extra holes and I hate the way things look. So now I have to mask that with something. It's hardened. I'm not worried about damage, but I did an impression, and the impression has to be up here in order for me to get this thing on the hinge line. So what I'm going to do to cover that is I'm just going to take a piece of aluminum trim tape, and I'm just going to tape that around there. And I think that would give it a neat little look, and it would cover that hole up. So we're going to drill a new hole. We're going to wick it full of CA. We're going to get that thing back in there. We got to build the stuff right. If you don't build it right, then you wind up with a crappy flying airplane, and we don't want that. So anyway, let's re-drill. Let's do what we need to do to fix this using the hardware that was supplied. I don't think that looks bad. You can kind of tell that there was a hole underneath there, but it's not a gleaming hole with a bad colored patch job. If you can't make it blend in perfectly, make it stand out obnoxiously, I guess. Doesn't look bad, I'll take it. But at least now I know that it's set up right. So that's in. Let's get the elevator done and our flying wires. Now, because of the lesson learned on the rudder, you still want this thing, in order to have equal deflection both ways, you want that pivot right here on the hinge line. And what they recommend in the manual is that you actually run this rod out, measure out 25 millimeters, and then put that thing in. We have a lot of block here to work with, and I don't need all of that. But what I am going to do is kind of follow their guide. You could see I left a little bit of that screw stick out. And basically what I'm going to do is kind of follow that rod so I know as far as the angle goes. And I'm going to keep creeping this thing in until that hole is perfectly on the, and just so I can see it, we're going to mark it with a marker on this side. I'm going to follow this thing here, kind of use that push rod for a guide as to where I need to be as far as inboard and outboard. And I'm going to keep sliding that horn until it's looks to be right about there. And then I'm just going to push, and now I have an indentation right there, and that'll help give me my guide to follow. So that thing should be right in line with there, and it is. I don't like to drill a big hole first. Small pilot. There's that. And now we'll go ahead and we'll wick a little bit of CA into that and install our horn. All right, guys, and that wraps up part 1 of the Dancing Wings PT17 from BitgoHobby. If you're interested in checking this baby out for yourself, head on over to www.bitgohobby.com, link down in the description below, and check out all of the line of that they carry of the Dancing Wings products, plus many other foam models and other aircraft and things that they have on their site. With that being said, if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. It helps the channel out a lot. If you did not, and you're going to hit this baby, do that thing twice for me. Like, share, subscribe, all that cool, shameless stuff. With that being said, it's Brendan here at Just Plain Crazy. You guys are just plain crazy for hanging out and watching. I wish you guys happy flights. Peace out.